Indian Defense Minister Rajnath Singh said a recent Indian military response he called Operation Sindoor showed New Delhi can hit back decisively, and he ruled out broader talks with Pakistan, except on the part of Kashmir that Pakistan administers. India and Pakistan both claim the full former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. Each controls a portion, divided by the line of control, and the dispute has fueled wars and repeated crises since partition in 1947. Islamabad wants the wider Kashmir issue and related files, including the suspended Indus Waters Treaty over shared rivers, on the table, while New Delhi treats Pakistan-administered territory as the only agenda it will discuss and repeated rejects third-party mediation. Singh's line hardens that posture. Talks, if any, on India's terms and scope only. South Korean and U.S. companies signed agreements valued at about $950 billion to cooperate on chip production and supply over the next 5 years, Seoul's presidential office said. The announcements followed President Lee Jae-myung's arrival in San Francisco, where he met executives from OpenAI, Anthropic, and NVIDIA, and sketched South Korea's AI ambitions. South Korea is already home to memory chip giants central to global AI data center buildout. The United States wants trusted allies in advanced semiconductors as it competes with China. For Washington and Seoul, the package is industrial strategy as much as commercial paperwork, locking in capacity, tools, and AI partners across the Pacific. Indian Education Minister Dharmendra Pradhan resigned after nationwide youth-led protests over alleged university entrance exam paper leaks, and President Drupadi Murmu accepted the resignation while assigning cabinet colleague Prahlad Joshi additional charge of the ministry. Demonstrators in a campaign known as the Cockroach Movement said they were ending protests after the government accepted key demands, including the minister's exit. Anger had surged after medical entrance exams were scrapped and ordered retaken, reinforcing student claims that repeated leaks wreck fair competition for scarce university and professional seats. Protest organizers cast the resignation as overdue accountability for a broken testing system. The government presented it as answering student concerns while keeping the education ministry running without a gap. South Korean and U.S. businesses signed agreements valued at about $950 billion over 5 years on chip production and supply after President Lee Jae-myung arrived in San Francisco. Lee met chiefs of OpenAI, Anthropic, and NVIDIA and outlined Korea's AI plans at a summit, with Seoul's presidential office announcing the package. South Korea is already a global leader in memory chips. The push aims to lock advanced AI semiconductor capacity and supply chains to U.S. model builders and chip designers as both countries race to secure AI infrastructure. The headline figure bundles multi-year industrial cooperation rather than a single cash transfer on day one. Indian Education Minister Dharmendra Pradhan has stepped down, and President Draupadi Murmu accepted his resignation. Prahlad Joshi was given additional charge of the education ministry. Organizers of youth-led protests over alleged university entrance exam paper leaks said they are ending nationwide demonstrations after the government accepted key demands, including the minister's exit. India's ultra-competitive national entrance tests decide who reaches medical and other elite colleges, and repeated leak scandals have convinced many students that cheating rings can wipe out years of work for scarce seats. Protesters cast the resignation as accountability. The government presents the cabinet change and other concessions as closing the crisis. At the Kuomintang's National Congress in Taipei, party leader Cheng Li-won said Taiwan's largest opposition party wants to coordinate with the smaller Taiwan People's Party on fielding candidates for November's local elections. Those races choose mayors and county heads who control budgets, policing posture, and land use, and they often preview the next presidential map. The KMT has long favored closer cross-strait economic ties. The TPP is a third force that has pulled voters unhappy with both major camps. The ruling Democratic Progressive Party stresses a distinct Taiwan identity and deeper ties with the United States and like-minded partners. If opposition coordination holds, it could pool anti-DPP votes in key cities without a full party merger. Indian Education Minister Dharmendra Pradhan has resigned, and President Drupadi Murmu accepted it, with colleague Prahlad Joshi taking additional charge of the ministry. A youth-led campaign that NHK called the Cockroach Movement, sparked by alleged leaks of university entrance exams, agreed to end street protests after the government met key demands, including the minister's exit. In May, authorities had already scrapped medical school entrance results over suspected paper leaks and forced a retest, turning exam integrity into a national fairness fight for millions of applicants. Before yielding, the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party had tried to frame parts of the crisis as a blame game involving foreign countries, a line protesters rejected as dodge rather than fix. For students, the core grievance was simple. Leaked papers destroy years of preparation and trust in the only ladder many have into medicine and other elite tracks. Indian Education Minister Dharmendra Pradhan has resigned, and President Drupadi Murmu accepted it. Prahlad Joshi takes additional charge of the ministry. The youth-led Cockroach Movement said it is ending nationwide protests after the government met key demands, including the minister's exit over leaked university entrance exams. Anger boiled over after authorities in May scrapped medical school entrance results over suspected paper leaks and forced a retest, hitting a generation that treats national entrance scores. Kuomintang leader Cheng Li-won told the party's National Congress in Taipei that the KMT wants to coordinate with the Taiwan People's Party on candidates for November's local elections, aiming to widen the opposition camp. The KMT is Taiwan's main opposition party and historically the more China-friendly major force. The smaller TPP is a newer third party that draws voters frustrated with both big camps. Local elections choose city and county executives and councils. Austin, Texas police released body-worn camera video of officers fatally shooting a 17-year-old boy at a playground after responding to a mental health call the teen had placed himself. Officers believed he was armed. Investigators later found only a water bottle. Police Chief Lisa Davis's description of the death as suicide by police drew sharp criticism from people who say that label shifts blame onto a child in crisis. U.S. departments increasingly publish body cam after fatal shootings under transparency pressure, while families and reform advocates argue the footage often shows rushed threat calls when the object in hand is not a gun. Kuomintang Chair Cheng Li-won told the party's National Congress in Taipei that the KMT wants deeper opposition coordination with the Taiwan People's Party, including joint candidates for November's local elections. The KMT is Taiwan's main opposition party and historically favors closer cross-strait engagement. The smaller TPP is a newer third force that draws voters frustrated with both major camps. Local elections choose city and county executives and councils that control budgets and patronage on the ground, so opposition pacts can limit vote splitting against the ruling. IRGC QDUS Force Commander Brigadier General Esmail Qaini said lifting what he called an 11-year blockade on Yemen is a just demand and urged Saudi Arabia to end restrictions affecting more than 38 million people. Separately, an Iranian foreign ministry spokesman said there is no military solution and called for dialogue on Yemen. Saudi-led intervention began in 2015 against the Houthi movement, which controls much of northern Yemen, including Sana'a, and is aligned with Iran. Riyadh and its partners describe maritime and air controls as security measures against weapons smuggling and Houthi attacks, while Tehran and the Houthis call them a siege. The appeal lands beside live Red Sea shipping risk and wider Iran-Saudi-US tension, so blockade language is both humanitarian messaging and leverage talk. The United States sanctioned Cuban Health Minister Jose Angel Portal Miranda and the island's network of overseas medical brigades, which Washington calls a major foreign currency earner for the Cuban state. For decades, Havana has exported doctors and health workers across Latin America, Africa, and beyond, branding the missions as humanitarian solidarity that also supports partner governments. U.S. officials and other critics argue many brigade contracts are coercive, with the state taking most of the pay, and say sanctions are meant to cut that revenue stream. Cuban authorities typically answer that the programs are legitimate cooperation and that U.S. penalties are another chapter in long-running economic pressure on the island. The practical stakes sit with the minister who runs the system and with host countries that still rely on Cuban clinicians. Reporting says areas around Tehran were hit for the first time in the latest round of U.S. strikes, a sign the target set is widening beyond earlier aim points. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the regime's most powerful security force, answered by threatening to halt all energy exports from the Middle East if a blockade is imposed. That threat lands on the world's most sensitive oil artery, exports that move through the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. Washington frames expanded strikes as pressure on the Iranian state. Tehran frames them as an attack that could justify choking regional energy flows. Markets and shippers watch whether rhetoric becomes an actual closure attempt. The United States carried out a 13th straight night of strikes on Iran, saying the latest wave was meant to cut the threat Tehran poses to commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow mouth of the Persian Gulf that carries a large share of the world's seaborne oil. Tehran has warned of further escalation in the Gulf, raising the risk of tit-for-tat attacks on ships, bases, or energy infrastructure. At home, reporting points to a looming congressional fight over Iran-related war funding after more than $37.5 billion already spent, so the military tempo and the budget politics are now moving together. New video showed damage from earthquakes in Venezuela on June 24th. Official sources cited in the report said the quakes killed 5,208 people and injured more than 16,000 others. Totals differ across prior government updates and warrant cautious handling. South Korean and U.S. companies signed deals valued at about $950 billion over 5 years on chip production and supply after President Lee Jae-myung met U.S. tech chiefs including OpenAI, Anthropic, and NVIDIA in San Francisco. South Korea is already a top maker of memory chips and wants a larger role in AI hardware. The package ties that push to American chip design and AI platforms. Totals this large usually blend planned investment, supply commitments, and cooperation pledges rather than cash paid up front. Millions of Muslims from Iraq and elsewhere are gathering in Karbala, Iraq, to commemorate Arba'een. The pilgrimage marks a major annual Shia observance centered on the city. The United States cut a proposed Section 301 tariff on India to 10%, with nearly half of exports remaining exempt. The move adjusts a bilateral slice of Washington's wider tariff campaign toward major partners. Unconfirmed, Donald Trump said Russian President Vladimir Putin told him Russia would not sell weapons to Iran. Coverage noted the remark alongside continued U.S. arms support for Ukraine through NATO channels. The claim is attributed to Trump and is not independently confirmed in the source package. India's Ministry of External Affairs advised seafarers to exercise caution before taking jobs on commercial vessels in the Black Sea region amid elevated wartime maritime risk. Official Israeli documents indicated that 928 Italians served in the Israeli military during the Gaza war, most holding dual Italian-Israeli citizenship. The revelations prompted calls from politicians and human rights advocates for investigations into possible violations of international law and criticism of the Italian government after reports that Israeli soldiers were hosted in Italy for post-war recovery. The Russian Foreign Ministry said Russia will seek the extradition of former International Criminal Court prosecutor Karim Khan, who had sought an arrest warrant for President Vladimir Putin and later left his post amid workplace sexual harassment allegations. Russia said Khan is wanted at the federal level and that it intends to hold him criminally liable over what it called persecution of innocent individuals. President Draupadi Murmu and Prime Minister Narendra Modi paid tribute to Indian soldiers who fought in the Kargil conflict on Kargil Vijay Divas. Hundreds of demonstrators marched through Berlin in support of Palestine and Lebanon, carrying Palestinian flags, banners, and placards and chanting solidarity slogans. In Hamburg, activists held a remembrance and protest for Palestinian children killed in Gaza, writing down their names. Kuomintang leader Cheng Li-wen said the party aims to expand opposition forces by cooperating with the Taiwan People's Party in November local elections. Speaking at the KMT National Congress in Taipei, she outlined plans to coordinate candidate fielding with the second largest opposition party. Protesters demonstrated in Milan, Italy, in solidarity with Gaza, calling for an end to what they described as genocide and the Israeli occupation. Kuomintang leader Cheng Li-wen told the party's National Congress in Taipei that the KMT wants to coordinate with the Taiwan People's Party on candidates for November's local elections and widen the opposition camp. The KMT is Taiwan's main opposition party and the traditional vehicle for voters who favor closer cross-strait engagement. The TPP is a smaller third force that pulls anti-establishment and younger votes. Local races fill mayoral and county posts that shape daily governance and can preview coalitions before the next national cycle under the ruling Democratic Progressive Party. Talk of joint fielding is seat math, not a merger. The Indian Coast Guard rescued 170 people in flood-hit Daman, Dadra, and Nagar Haveli in South Gujarat. UNESCO's World Heritage Committee, meeting in Busan, South Korea, added Japan's ancient capitals of Asuka and Fujiwara to the World Heritage List. Japan had nominated 19 archaeological sites in Nara Prefecture from the 6th to 8th centuries, including early imperial court remains and the Takamatsuzuka tomb. The sites mark the era when a centralized Japanese state and Buddhist court culture took shape before the better-known Nara and Kyoto capitals. Hundreds marched in Berlin, carrying Palestinian flags and banners in solidarity with Palestinians in Lebanon, while demonstrators in Milan called for an end to what they termed genocide and Israel's occupation of Gaza. Street protests like these have been a recurring feature in major European cities whenever the Gaza war intensifies, aimed at pressuring Western governments over arms, diplomacy, and recognition. Google named 33 startups for its Gemini for Startups cybersecurity track, including 11 Israeli firms that will get access to Google AI models, cloud tools, and infrastructure. Google Cloud and DeepMind are also set to work with Israeli cybersecurity company Wiz on AI-driven security systems. The picks drew criticism from voices who opposed deeper tech ties with Israel's security-linked industry during the wider regional war. Kuomintang leader Cheng Li-wun told the party's National Congress in Taipei that the KMT wants to coordinate with the smaller Taiwan People's Party on candidates for November's local elections, held every 4 years. The KMT is Taiwan's main opposition party and generally favors warmer ties with Beijing. The TPP is a newer third force that has drawn voters unhappy with both major camps. Local races matter because they test opposition strength against the ruling Democratic Progressive Party, which takes a harder line on China ahead of the next national cycle. President Drupadi Murmu and Prime Minister Narendra Modi paid tributes to Indian soldiers killed in the 1999 Kargil conflict on Kargil Vijay Divos. The July 26th observance marks India's recapture of high Himalayan positions after Pakistani troops and militants occupied ridgelines in Ladakh's Kargil sector along the line of control. It is one of India's central military remembrance days. South Korean and U.S. companies signed agreements valued at about $950 billion over 5 years on chip production and supply after President Lee Jae-myung met leaders of OpenAI, Anthropic, and NVIDIA in San Francisco. South Korea is already a global memory chip powerhouse. Tying that base more tightly to U.S. AI model firms is meant to lock in advanced semiconductor capacity as governments treat AI compute as strategic infrastructure. Hundreds of demonstrators marched through Berlin carrying Palestinian flags, banners, and placards and chanting in solidarity with Palestinians in Lebanon. Large pro Palestine street actions have been a recurring feature in European capitals as the Gaza war and related fighting in Lebanon keep drawing diaspora and local protest networks into the streets. Authorities in Rostov-on-Don, a major city in southern Russia near the Ukrainian border, declared a local state of emergency after severe weather. The reported injury toll has risen to 28 residents. A typhoon forced more than 710,000 people to evacuate in southern China, with most of those temporarily moved out of urban districts in Huizhou and Shanwei, coastal Guangdong cities east of the Pearl River Delta. Large preemptive evacuations are a standard Chinese tool before landfalling storms. Poland has proposed to the United States that Patriot surface-to-air missiles be produced jointly with Ukraine, with a Polish deputy defense minister saying the work should be done in a safe location. Patriots are a top Western system for stopping cruise missiles and drones, and joint production would aim to ease tight supply while giving Ukraine and nearby NATO states a deeper industrial stake in air defense. A typhoon forced more than 710,000 people from their homes in southern China, with most temporary evacuations in the coastal cities of Huizhou and Shanwei in Guangdong east of the Pearl River Delta. Large preemptive moves are standard Chinese practice when a strong storm tracks toward dense urban districts. Israeli police detained several people at a pro-Palestinian demonstration in Tel Aviv on July 25th. Activists demanded an end to settler violence in the occupied West Bank and to Israeli military operations in Gaza, a reminder that street dissent inside Israel continues alongside the wider war. Kuomintang leader Cheng Li-wun told the party's National Congress in Taipei she wants to coordinate with the smaller Taiwan People's Party in November's local elections to widen the opposition. The KMT is Taiwan's main opposition party and is generally more open to engagement with Beijing than the ruling Democratic Progressive Party. The TPP is a third force party that draws voters unhappy with both majors. Local races will not change the presidency, but joint opposition slates could reshape city and county power and the island's political mood toward China. India's first hydrogen train saved more than 3,200 liters of diesel across its first 1,200 kilometers of trial runs, a milestone officials are using to showcase alternative rail power. Hydrogen trains make electricity on board with fuel cells, a lower emission option on lines that are expensive to wire with full overhead electrification, and part of India's push to cut diesel use and oil imports on the railways. India has spudded, or begun drilling, the first appraisal well in the Mahanadi offshore basin, a follow-up step that tests whether earlier exploration hints can support commercial oil or gas. Appraisal wells sit between discovery and full field development and feed New Delhi's wider drive to lift domestic energy supply and ease costly fuel imports. Israeli police detained several people at a pro-Palestinian demonstration in Tel Aviv after activists called for an end to settler violence in the occupied West Bank and to Israel's military campaign in Gaza. Even in wartime, Tel Aviv still sees periodic street protests over Gaza and the West Bank, and detentions often follow when police say crowds blocked roads or ignored dispersal orders. Kuomintang leader Cheng Li-wun told the party's National Congress in Taipei that the KMT wants to coordinate candidate fielding with the Taiwan People's Party for November's local elections, aiming to widen the opposition camp. The KMT is Taiwan's main opposition party and historically the larger rival to the ruling Democratic Progressive Party. The TPP is the island's second largest opposition force. Local races do not decide the presidency, but coordinated opposition tickets can shape city and county power and the runway into the next national cycle. Israeli forces began demolishing a Palestinian home in Jalboun, west of Jenin, saying it was built without an Israeli-issued permit. Separately, footage showed a Palestinian-owned quarry set on fire by Israeli settlers in Erif, south of Nablus. The twin incidents add to a multi-day surge of demolitions and settler attacks across the northern West Bank. Israel controls building permits in large parts of Area C and says unlicensed structures are illegal. Palestinians and rights groups call the permit system nearly impossible to clear and say settler arson rarely brings real accountability. Russia's foreign ministry said it will seek the extradition of Karim Khan, the former International Criminal Court prosecutor who pursued an arrest warrant for President Vladimir Putin over the Ukraine war and later left his post amid workplace sexual harassment allegations. Moscow says Khan is wanted at the federal level for what it calls persecution of innocent people. The ICC does not recognize Russian jurisdiction here, and any handover would face steep legal and political barriers. Russian Navy Chief Admiral Alexander Moiseev said Bore-class nuclear ballistic missile submarines armed with Bulava missiles will serve for the next 30 to 40 years. He also said the Navy has stood up unmanned systems units, already fields a Poseidon carrier, is building a large new unmanned vessel, and that the overhauled nuclear cruiser Admiral Nakimov is finishing trials. Bore boats are the sea leg of Russia's nuclear deterrent. Poseidon is a nuclear-powered underwater drone Russia advertises as a strategic weapon. The Indian Coast Guard says it rescued 170 people from flooding in Daman, Dadra and Nagar Haveli, and South Gujarat. The belt is a low-lying coastal and riverine stretch north of Mumbai that often floods hard in monsoon surges. South Korean and U.S. companies signed deals worth $950 billion over 5 years to cooperate on semiconductor production and supply, Seoul's presidential office said. The pacts followed President Lee Jae-myung's arrival in San Francisco, where he met chiefs of OpenAI, Anthropic, and NVIDIA and outlined South Korea's AI ambitions, binding a top memory chip economy more tightly to U.S. artificial intelligence supply chains. Unconfirmed initial report. Several people were hurt after a vehicle drove into pedestrians in Berlin, and authorities declared a state of emergency. Cause and intent, whether accident, medical episode, or deliberate attack, were not established in this package. European capitals treat vehicle into crowd incidents as high alert events until investigators rule intent in or out. India's education minister, Dharmendra Pradhan, resigned after President Draupadi Murmu accepted his departure, and Prahlad Joshi was given additional charge of the ministry. A youth-led movement over alleged leaks of university entrance exam papers had agreed to end nationwide protests once the government met key demands, including the minister's exit. Anger spiked after authorities scrapped medical entrance results in May over suspected leaks and ordered a retest, high-stakes exams that can decide who enters medicine and other scarce public university seats. For millions of Indian families, a fair entrance paper is treated as the main ladder into stable professional careers. Leak scandals are read as elite capture of that ladder. Protesters cast the resignation as accountability. The government presents the cabinet change and retests as restoring integrity without conceding systemic collapse. Kuomintang leader Cheng Li-woon told the party's National Congress in Taipei that the KMT wants broader opposition coordination with the Taiwan People's Party for November local elections, including on fielding candidates. The KMT is Taiwan's main opposition party, long associated with closer engagement toward Beijing. The TPP is a smaller third force that has pulled younger and protest-minded voters. Local races build grassroots machines that matter in later national cycles, so opposition deal-making could pressure the ruling Democratic Progressive Party, which champions a stronger separate Taiwan identity. No formal joint slate was announced, only an aim to widen cooperation. UNESCO's World Heritage Committee listed Japan's ancient capitals of Asuka and Fujiwara at a session in Busan, South Korea. Japan nominated 19 archaeological sites in Nara Prefecture from the 6th to 8th centuries, including imperial D-court remains and the Takamatsuzuka tomb, places from the era when an early centralized Japanese state took shape before the capital moved on to Nara and later Kyoto. India's youth-led protest wave over leaked competitive exam papers is standing down after New Delhi accepted key demands, caped by Education Minister Dharmendra Pradhan's resignation. President Draupadi Murmu accepted the resignation and gave cabinet colleague Prahad Joshi additional charge of the Education Ministry. For millions of Indian students, national entrance and recruitment tests are the main gate to medical seats, engineering colleges, and government jobs, so paper leaks are read as stealing years of preparation and deepening distrust in the exam system. Protesters had pressed for accountability at the top. The ruling Bharatiya Janata Party had earlier tried to frame parts of the crisis as a blame game involving foreign countries, a line critics treated as deflection from domestic exam security failures. Kuomintang leader Cheng Li-won told the party's National Congress in Taipei the KMT wants wider opposition cooperation with the Taiwan People's Party in November's local elections, including coordinating candidates. The KMT is Taiwan's main opposition and the large party most open to engagement with Beijing. The TPP is a smaller third force. Local races function as a midterm-style test of President Lai Ching-te's ruling Democratic Progressive Party, which stresses a sharper Taiwan identity separate from China. South Korean and U.S. businesses signed deals totaling about $950 billion over 5 years on semiconductor production and supply after South Korean President Lee Jae-myung met chiefs of OpenAI, Anthropic, NVIDIA, and other U.S. firms in San Francisco. Seoul is pushing deeper AI and chip partnership with Washington as advanced semiconductors become a core strategic industry for both economies. Kuomintang leader Cheng Li-won told the party's National Congress in Taipei that Taiwan's largest opposition party wants to coordinate with the Taiwan People's Party on candidates for November's local elections. The KMT is the main opposition and is generally seen as more open to engagement with Beijing. The TPP is a smaller third force popular with some swing and younger voters. Pooling candidates would test whether opposition parties can cut into the ground game of the ruling Democratic Progressive Party, which stresses a sharper Taiwan identity separate from China. A typhoon has forced more than 710,000 people from their homes in southern China, with most temporary moves in the coastal Guangdong cities of Huizhou and Shanwei, east of the Pearl River Delta. Large pre-storm evacuations are a standard Chinese civil defense play when major systems threaten that dense southern seaboard. South Korean and U.S. companies signed agreements worth about $950 billion over 5 years on chip production and supply after President Lee Jae-myung arrived in San Francisco. Lee met chiefs of U.S. AI and semiconductor firms, including OpenAI, Anthropic, and NVIDIA, and outlined Seoul's AI plans, tightening ties between a top memory chip power and the U.S. firms racing to secure advanced processors and supply chains. Hundreds of demonstrators marched through Berlin with Palestinian flags and banners in solidarity with Palestinians in Lebanon. Large pro-Palestine street marches are recurring in the German capital, even as national policy remains firmly tied to Israel's security. The Indian Coast Guard pulled 170 people to safety from flood-hit Daman, the Dadra and Nagar Haveli area, and South Gujarat. Monsoon flooding regularly cuts off low-lying coastal and river communities in western India, so large multi-district rescues are a recurring summer emergency response. South Korean and U.S. companies signed agreements worth about $950 billion over 5 years to cooperate on chip production and supply, Seoul's presidential office said after President Lee Jae-myung landed in San Francisco. He met leaders of OpenAI, Anthropic, and NVIDIA while pitching South Korea's Off-I plans. South Korea is already a global memory chip powerhouse, so the package is about locking Korean manufacturing muscle into America's AI supply chain rather than a routine trade photo op. A typhoon forced more than 710,000 people from their homes in southern China's Guangdong province, with most temporary moves in the coastal cities of Huizhou and Shanwei. Authorities routinely cleared dense urban districts along this stretch of coast when a strong storm tracks toward the Pearl River Delta fringe, where flooding and wind damage can cut roads and overwhelm low-lying neighborhoods. India's first hydrogen-powered train saved more than 3,200 liters of diesel over its first 1,200 kilometers of pilot service, state broadcaster DD News reported. Hydrogen trains generate electricity from fuel cells instead of burning diesel, a trial technology New Delhi is testing as it looks to cut fuel costs and emissions on non-electrified routes. A typhoon has forced the temporary evacuation of more than 710,000 people in southern China, with most of the displaced coming from the urban districts of Huizhou and Shanwei in coastal Guangdong. Those cities sit on the province's Pacific-facing shore east of the Pearl River Delta, where large preemptive moves inland are a standard Chinese playbook when a major storm threatens dense low-lying districts. UNESCO's World Heritage Committee, meeting in Busan, South Korea, has added Japan's ancient capitals of Asuka and Fujiwara to the World Heritage List. The nomination covers 19 archaeological sites in Nara Prefecture from the 6th to 8th centuries, an era when Japan's imperial court was consolidating at Asuka and later Fujiwara, including palace remains and the Takamatsuzuka tomb, known for its painted murals. Listing is cultural recognition and a tourism magnet, not a change in sovereignty or daily law. At the Kuomintang's National Congress in Taipei, party leader Cheng Li-won said Taiwan's largest opposition party wants to coordinate with the smaller Taiwan People's Party on November local elections, including how candidates are fielded. The Kuomintang is the historic main opposition to the ruling Democratic Progressive Party and generally favors warmer ties with Beijing. The TPP is a newer third force that has drawn voters frustrated with the two big camps. Local races do not set cross-strait military policy, but joint opposition ticket management can reshape who controls cities and counties and the springboard for the next presidential cycle. India's Coast Guard says it pulled 170 people from floodwaters in Daman, the Dadra and Nagar Haveli area, and South Gujarat, coastal and low-lying western districts that often take the brunt of the summer monsoon. The operation is a response to communities cut off or stranded as rivers and drainage systems overflowed. You're watching Peppermint News Network. We pull news from around the world and open source channels, compile it, strip bias and charged language, add the background and stakeholder viewpoints you need, and put it on air fast. Peppermint News Network, an independent desk watching global wires and open source channels, compiling the signal, removing spin, adding stakeholder viewpoints, and delivering a clear brief. French authorities detained 6 people on suspicion of preparing a terrorist attack, FFP reported. Investigators have not yet publicly named a motive, target, or ideology, so this remains an early-stage counter-terror case rather than a fully described plot. The European Union has imposed a travel ban and asset freeze on Arkady Dvorkovich, a former Russian deputy prime minister, later known for roles in technology and international chess administration. The listing is another name-by-name step in the EU's successive sanctions packages aimed at people tied to Russia's political and economic elite over the war in Ukraine. A major fire broke out Saturday at the burial complex of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, known as the Alter Rebbe, founding figure of Chabad Lubavitch Hasidism in Hadiak, in Ukraine's Poltava region. The blaze reportedly damaged the historic synagogue, a pilgrimage reception center, and parts of the grounds around the grave. Chabad is a global Hasidic movement, and Hadiak draws tens of thousands of Jewish pilgrims each year to the Rebbe's tomb. The account is single source and does not establish how the fire started or the full extent of loss. American singer Katy Perry said she was deeply shocked and angered that the White House used her song Firework in a TikTok video of U.S. strikes on southern Iran without her knowledge or consent. The post synced a section of the track to strike footage and said Iran had been warned. The complaint lands as a consent fight over a pop anthem being tied to the live U.S.-Iran military campaign. Kuomintang leader Cheng Li-won told the party's National Congress in Taipei that the KMT wants to coordinate with the Taiwan People's Party for local elections due in November, aiming to widen the opposition camp. The KMT is Taiwan's main opposition party and the one historically most open to warmer ties with Beijing. The TPP is a smaller third force that draws reform-minded and younger voters. November's races pick city and county chiefs and councils and often preview the island's next presidential map against the ruling Democratic Progressive Party, which favors a sharper political distance from China. The Indian Coast Guard says it rescued 170 people from flood-hit Daman, Dadra, and Nagar Haveli and parts of South Gujarat after heavy monsoon rains. Daman and the nearby Union Territory sit on India's west coast north of Mumbai, where seasonal flooding regularly cuts roads and strands coastal and river communities. Sightings of humpback whale supergroups, unusually large feeding gatherings, are increasing off South Africa. Humpbacks and dolphins are among at least 37 marine mammal species recorded in South African waters, a biodiversity hotspot on major whale migration routes. Roscosmos chief Dmitry Bakhanov said Russia will keep working with Kazakhstan at Baikonur and that the two sides have agreed on 9 Proton-M launches. Baikonur is the Soviet-built cosmodrome in Kazakhstan that Moscow still leases as a core launch site. Proton-M is a heavy Russian rocket used for satellites and other payloads. The deal signals that space cooperation remains a stable bilateral track even when other Russia-Kazakhstan issues are sensitive. UNESCO has added 6 ancient Medinas in the Comoros to its World Heritage List. The Comoros is a small island country in the Indian Ocean between East Africa and Madagascar. Medinas are historic old city quarters. Here, a still inhabited fabric of palaces, mosques, public squares, and narrow streets, some dating to the 12th century. Listing can bring conservation aid and tourism attention, along with duties to protect the sites. India's first hydrogen-powered passenger train has saved more than 3,200 liters of diesel over its first 1,200 kilometers in service, an early marker for the pilot. Hydrogen trains run on fuel cells that make electricity on board, cutting local diesel use on routes that are costly or slow to fully electrify. Hundreds of demonstrators marched through Berlin, carrying Palestinian flags, banners, and placards, and chanting in solidarity with Palestinians and Lebanon. Large pro-Palestinian street marches have been a recurring feature in major European capitals, as the Gaza war and related fighting in Lebanon keep drawing diaspora and local activist crowds. Drilling has started on the first appraisal well in India's Mahanadi offshore basin, a step state broadcaster DD News described as supporting the country's energy security efforts. An appraisal well checks whether an earlier offshore discovery can support commercial production. The basin lies off India's east coast in the Bay of Bengal, where New Delhi has long sought more domestic oil and gas to ease import dependence. The report did not name the operator, reserve size, or a development timeline. Taiwan's main opposition party, the Kuomintang, or KMT, says it wants to coordinate candidates with the smaller Taiwan People's Party, or TPP, ahead of November's local elections. KMT leader Cheng Li-won told the party's National Congress in Taipei the goal is to widen the opposition camp rather than split anti-incumbent votes. Those races pick city and county heads and councils, often treated as a midterm-style test for the ruling Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP. The KMT has long favored warmer ties with Beijing than the DPP. The TPP brands itself a third force focused on governance and living costs. Kuomintang leader Cheng Li-won told the party's National Congress in Taipei that the KMT wants to widen the opposition by coordinating with the Taiwan People's Party in November's local elections held island-wide every 4 years. The KMT is Taiwan's main opposition party and historically favors warmer ties with Beijing. The TPP is a smaller third force that has drawn younger and anti-establishment voters. Local races cover mayors, county magistrates, and councils, and often preview national strength against the ruling Democratic Progressive Party, which takes a harder line on China. NHK reported the KMT aim. This package does not say the TPP has agreed to any formal pact. The Georgian state electric system, the country of Georgia's grid operator, said electricity supply has been fully restored nationwide. The brief statement gave no cause, duration, or outage map, so the scale and trigger remain unclear from this report alone. U.S. President Donald Trump attended a rescheduled White House Correspondents Association dinner in Washington under heightened security, months after the original April event was cut short by a shooting. In a speech lasting roughly an hour, he said the country does not yield to political violence and affirmed belief in freedom of speech, standard themes at a ritual that gathers the president, administration figures, and the press corps. Georgia's state grid operator said electricity supply has been fully restored across the country after an outage whose cause and length were not detailed in the available report. This is the South Caucasus Republic centered on Tbilisi, not the U.S. state, so a nationwide blackout and recovery matter mainly as a domestic infrastructure event unless a cause pointing to sabotage or regional stress later emerges. Two children were killed by a landmine explosion in Yemen's al-Baida province, according to Al Arabiya, which attributed the device to Houthi forces, an attribution that remains the channel's claim. Al-Baida sits in central Yemen, long scarred by the civil war between the Iran-aligned Houthis, who control much of the northwest and the capital Sana'a, and the Saudi-backed government side. Unexploded mines and improvised devices left from years of fighting remain a leading killer of civilians, especially children in rural areas. Brazil has banned production of foie gras and other foods made by force-feeding animals. Foie gras is a luxury pâté from duck or goose liver enlarged, sometimes up to about 10 times normal size, by gavage, a practice already fully outlawed in several other countries on animal welfare grounds. Georgia, the South Caucasus country between Russia, Turkey, and the Black Sea, suffered a second major power outage in 2 days, leaving areas nationwide without electricity and cutting water in the capital, Tbilisi, after pumping stations shut down. The cause of the new blackout is under investigation. A similar outage a day earlier was blamed on a malfunction at the Inguri hydroelectric power plant, a critical Soviet-era dam that supplies a large share of the country's power near the breakaway Abkhazia line. German Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul is courting African partners on energy, infrastructure, and trade as Berlin looks for deeper economic ties and more diversified energy relationships. On the same trip, he criticized United States' treatment of South Africa, adding a political edge to what is otherwise a partnership pitch. United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said control and exploitation of natural resources are now dramatically changing why wars start, how they are fought, and how they end. The warning points to oil, minerals, and other commodities as core stakes in modern conflict, not just background wealth. A third straight day of heavy monsoon rain has flooded large parts of south and central Gujarat, disrupting transport and forcing about 38,000 people from their homes. India's army, plus national and state disaster teams and the Coast Guard, are running rescue operations in the worst-hit districts. Reporting says fuel shortages have spread across almost every Russian region as Ukraine steps up drone strikes on energy-related targets deep behind the front. Separately, Moscow said President Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump held a businesslike 90-minute call on July 4th, another diplomatic track running beside the long-range strike war. Yemen's Houthi forces say they attacked shipping in the Red Sea, the shortcut route between Asia and Europe via the Suez Canal. The claim adds to a pattern of Houthi maritime attacks that have already forced many operators to reroute and raised insurance costs whenever Middle East fighting widens. A month after twin earthquakes hit Venezuela, thousands of victims are still listed missing, and families keep searching. An Israeli army rescuer called hard-hit La Guaira, a dense Caribbean coastal state next to Caracas, a colossal disaster, and described finding a family who died locked in an embrace. Separate analysis notes the catastrophe has not quickly forced a democratic transition, so political change around President Nicolas Maduro's government remains uncertain even as the humanitarian toll lingers. India criticized Pakistan for raising Jammu and Kashmir and Indus water issues at an ASEAN meeting, arguing those disputes do not belong on that multilateral agenda. The clash is another public round in the long India-Pakistan fight over Kashmir and control of Indus Basin rivers, reported here from Indian coverage of the exchange. Taiwan's Central Weather Administration has issued a sea warning for Tropical Storm Nul as the system strengthens east of the Philippines and tracks toward waters south of the island. Sea warnings flag dangerous conditions for shipping and coastal activity before any fuller land threat alert. A Russian strike on an energy facility in Ukraine's northern city of Chernihiv and the surrounding district cut power to about 150,000 residents, according to the regional electricity distributor. Grid attacks remain a recurring tool aimed at civilian endurance and rear area infrastructure well behind the front. U.S. activist Laura Loomer, a close public ally of President Donald Trump who had previously downplayed Russia's invasion, met Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky after visiting Ukraine. She said she lived through an air raid and argued the change of heart could carry political weight in Washington, more a signal inside Trump world opinion than a formal U.S. policy shift. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said a clash between China and the Philippines near Second Thomas Shoal was an escalation that benefits no one, adding Washington's diplomatic weight after the latest scrape in disputed South China Sea waters. The Philippines is a U.S. treaty ally, so Rubio's line signals concern and calls for restraint without, on this report, announcing a new military step. Nigeria's Dangote refinery, the largest on the continent, built by Aliko Dangote's group to cut a major oil producer's odd reliance on imported fuel, says it has locked in $2.5 billion from private investors. The money is meant to fund expansion and push product toward East Africa, aiming to turn the plant into a wider regional supply hub. President Donald Trump threatened strikes on Iran and Yemen's Houthi forces after attacks on Saudi tankers, warning of major military punishment. The Houthis, an Iran-aligned movement that controls much of northern Yemen, have repeatedly targeted Red Sea and Gulf shipping. The United Nations said the wider situation is out of control. Ukraine has struck warehouses linked to Wildberries, Russia's dominant online retail platform, hitting a consumer logistics hub, pushes the war beyond energy and military sites into everyday shopping and delivery networks ordinary Russians use. The Justice Department withdrew subpoenas seeking phone records of New York Times journalists who reported on security features of the new Air Force One aircraft, planes tied to a Qatari donation that already drew political heat. Pulling the demands cools an immediate fight over whether a national security leak hunt can reach reporters' call logs. It does not erase the deeper arguments about press freedom, the plane's foreign origin, and what the public is allowed to know about presidential air security. The eastern Indian state of Odisha has proposed a policy reform called Nutan Sakala, aimed at curbing trafficking of women and girls. Odisha has recorded the highest number of human trafficking victims in India every year since 2021, yet conviction rates have been near zero in some of those years, a gap that leaves survivors with little justice. Poverty and disaster-prone rural districts feed migration routes where recruiters promise distant jobs and instead sell people into forced work or sexual exploitation. The plan's real test is whether new rules produce investigations, rescues, and prison sentences, not only another official framework on paper. Nigeria's army has declared Private Mohammed Yusuf Amutu wanted for allegedly selling and supplying military uniforms to groups it calls terrorists and to other criminals. Real uniforms matter because they help gunmen fake checkpoints, blend into security columns, or stage attacks while looking like the state. The headquarters, Nigerian Army Ordnance Corps, the branch that handles army materiel, issued the notice. Canadian Foreign Minister Anita Anand is in Islamabad on an official visit aimed at widening trade and economic ties with Pakistan, a relationship that usually sits well below Canada's higher-profile Asia partnerships. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said advisors to Vladimir Putin are increasingly blaming the Russian leader for mounting losses in Ukraine and pushing for more troops, a Kyiv claim that cannot be independently confirmed from inside the Kremlin. Zelensky argued that Ukraine's battlefield position is creating a toxic atmosphere around Putin, and again said Putin alone started the war and is why it has not ended. France has moved ahead of its European Union partners with a national ban on social media use by children, a step other capitals have debated but not yet locked in as hard law. The measure puts Paris at the front of a wider Western fight over youth mental health, addictive feeds, and how far governments should police platform access. Inside the EU, it also creates a patchwork risk. Kids' rules may now differ sharply between France and neighboring states, until any bloc-wide standard catches up. Uganda has sent home its last known Ebola patient, a practical milestone that means no one is still in treatment for the hemorrhagic fever. Health authorities still run a fixed watch period with no new cases before they can formally declare the outbreak over, so the all clear is not automatic yet. Washington is warning that the European Union's roughly €890 million penalty on Google under the Digital Markets Act could unsettle a broader EU-US trade package still being worked through. The Digital Markets Act is Brussels' flagship rulebook for very large online platforms, meant to curb gatekeeper power over app stores, search, and default settings that European officials say lock in big tech advantages. U.S. officials frame the fine as regulatory overreach that creates major uncertainty for American exporters and tech firms operating in Europe. EU authorities cast the case as ordinary enforcement of rules that apply to dominant platforms regardless of nationality, not a trade weapon. The clash lands on a familiar fault line: European digital sovereignty versus U.S. pressure to keep the transatlantic commercial relationship predictable for its largest tech companies. Almost 2 years after 6 travelers died and 1 survivor was left blind from suspected methanol-tainted drinks in Laos, prosecutors are moving a criminal case against a distillery owner. Methanol is a cheap industrial alcohol, sometimes used to adulterate spirits, and it can kill or permanently blind in small amounts. Families still want clear answers and tough penalties. The owner faces charges of running an illegal business and selling harmful products. Australia will put another $3.2 billion into nuclear-powered submarines under a UK-US the 2021 Defence Pact with Washington and London. The plan is for Canberra to receive 3 US boats first, then jointly build a new class with Britain in the 2040s, a long-horizon bet meant to harden Australia's navy as rivalry with China shapes the Indo-Pacific. Brent crude, the world's main oil benchmark, pushed back above $100 a barrel and held near 100.85 after touching about 102, a 2-month high, as traders priced in fresh Middle East supply risk. Reports cited attacks by Yemen's Houthi forces, an armed movement aligned with Iran, on Saudi tankers in the Red Sea, adding danger on a core route that moves oil and cargo between Asia and Europe. That pressure stacks onto long-running worry about the Strait of Hormuz, the tighter Gulf choke point through which a large share of seaborne crude must pass. When tankers look unsafe on either waterway, freighters reroute or idle, and global prices can jump because spare alternate paths are limited. The United Nations Secretary General warned the wider Middle East crisis was getting out of control, a diplomatic alarm that reinforces why energy markets are reacting now. China has begun 2 days of live fire drills in parts of the Taiwan Strait near Fujian Province, the mainland coast directly facing Taiwan. The timing, reported a day after U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio met Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi at an ASEAN meeting in Manila, will be read as either routine training or political signaling after high-level contact. The United States carried out a 13th straight night of strikes on Iran, saying the latest wave was meant to cut the threat Tehran poses to commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow mouth of the Persian Gulf that carries a large share of the world's seaborne oil. Tehran has warned of further escalation in the Gulf, raising the risk of tit-for-tat attacks on ships, bases, or energy infrastructure. At home, reporting points to a looming congressional fight over Iran-related war funding after more than $37.5 billion already spent, so the military tempo and the budget politics are now moving together. Prahlad Joshi has formally taken charge as India's Union Education Minister in New Delhi and reviewed major ministry schemes with officials. The post oversees national school and higher education policy in the world's most populous country, so a new minister can shift priorities on exams, universities, and central funding. UNESCO's World Heritage Committee, meeting in Busan, South Korea, has added Japan's ancient capitals of Asuka and Fujiwara to the World Heritage List. The nomination covers 19 archaeological sites in Nara Prefecture from the 6th to 8th centuries, including imperial court remains and the Takamatsuzuka tomb, known for its painted murals. These sites mark the era when an early centralized Japanese state took shape before the capital moved on to Nara and later Kyoto. The listing brings cultural recognition and is expected to draw more visitors without altering sovereignty or daily law. Hundreds of demonstrators marched through Berlin carrying Palestinian flags and banners and chanting in solidarity with Palestinians in Lebanon. The protest fits a familiar European street pattern of pro-Palestine marches that often widen to regional Middle East flashpoints when fighting or civilian hardship spikes. South Korean and U.S. businesses signed deals worth about $950 billion over 5 years on chip production and supply, Seoul's presidential office said after President Lee Jae-myung arrived in San Francisco. He met leaders of OpenAI, Anthropic, and NVIDIA and outlined South Korea's AI plans, underscoring how closely advanced AI now depends on the U.S.-Korea semiconductor partnership. India's first hydrogen-powered passenger train has saved more than 3,200 liters of diesel over its first 1,200 kilometers of service, according to state broadcaster DD News. The pilot is part of Indian Railways' effort to cut fossil fuel use on a network that still runs many diesel locomotives. Hydrogen trains make electricity on board with fuel cells and emit water vapor rather than exhaust. The report did not give routes, service dates, or a full cost comparison with conventional stock. India has spudded the first appraisal well in the Mahanadi offshore basin off the east coast in the Bay of Bengal. Appraisal wells sit between discovery and full field development, testing whether earlier exploration hints can support commercial oil or gas production. The step feeds New Delhi's drive to lift domestic energy supply, strengthen energy security, and ease costly fuel imports. State broadcaster DD News reported the start of drilling, but did not name the operator, reserve size, or any development timeline. K.T. Ramarao, a senior leader of Telangana's opposition Bharat Rashtra Samiti, is demanding the union education minister resign over the NEET paper leak scandal and justice for students who sat the exam. NEET is India's make-or-break national entrance test for medical college seats, so leak allegations hit millions of families' plans. KTR also accuses Telangana Chief Minister Revanth Reddy of changing the subject instead of pressing New Delhi. Wildfires across Europe have forced tens of thousands to evacuate. Spain declared a national emergency in the Madrid region, and French President Emmanuel Macron activated the EU Civil Protection Mechanism, the bloc's tool for requesting firefighting aircraft and crews from partner countries when national resources are stretched. Sweden has labeled mining of critical minerals and rare earths a national security interest and is easing and speeding the permit process. Rare earths and related minerals feed magnets, electronics, batteries, and defense systems, and China dominates much of the refining chain, so Stockholm is trying to unlock domestic supply and cut that dependence. Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega has announced plans to end elections, an unusually open statement that he will scrap remaining contests rather than only manage them. Ortega, who governs with Vice President Rosario Murillo, his wife, has already spent years jailing or exiling opponents, shuttering critical media, and hollowing out competitive politics after mass 2018 protests. Multiple international outlets say the move would remove what is left of electoral choice and has revived U.S. policy talk comparing Nicaragua to Cuba and Venezuela on isolation and sanctions. Supporters cast the presidency as defending a Sandinista revolutionary project against foreign meddling. Critics call this the formal burial of electoral democracy in Central America's largest country by some measures of political closure. UNESCO's World Heritage Committee, meeting in Busan, South Korea, has inscribed Japan's ancient capitals of Asuka and Fujiwara as a World Heritage Site. Japan nominated 19 archaeological sites in Nara Prefecture from the 6th to 8th centuries, including remains of early imperial courts and the Takamatsuzuka tomb, that mark the era when a centralized Japanese state and Buddhist court culture took shape. Kuomintang leader Cheng Li-woon told the party's National Congress in Taipei that Taiwan's largest opposition party wants to coordinate with the smaller Taiwan People's Party in the November local elections held every 4 years. Local races decide mayors and county chiefs who control budgets and land use, and opposition cooperation can split or concentrate the anti-ruling camp vote. The KMT traditionally favors closer ties with China. The TPP is a newer third force, so any deal is about beating the ruling camp locally as much as a single China policy line. South Korean and U.S. companies signed agreements worth about $950 billion over 5 years on chip production and supply after President Lee Jae-myung met chiefs of OpenAI, Anthropic, NVIDIA, and other U.S. firms in San Francisco. South Korea is already a global leader in memory chips. The package ties that industrial base to U.S. artificial intelligence demand as governments and tech giants race to lock down advanced semiconductor capacity. Seoul's presidential office cast the trip as aligning national AI plans with American partners. Indian Education Minister Dharmendra Pradhan has resigned, and President Draupadi Murmu accepted it, with colleague Prahlad Joshi taking additional charge of the ministry. A youth-led campaign that NHK called the Cockroach Movement, sparked by alleged leaks of university entrance exams, agreed to end street protests after the government met key demands, including the minister's exit. In May, authorities had already scrapped medical school entrance results over suspected paper leaks and forced a retest, turning exam